A $500 million project was going to bankrupt 15 architects, but the cleaning lady found the error and shocked the CEO. Before we get into the story, tell us in the comments, what is a hidden talent you have that might surprise people? And at the end of the story, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Enjoy! Julian Thorne didn't build buildings, he built legacies. He was the third generation of Thorne Architects, a firm whose name was etched onto the skylines of the world's most powerful cities. At 42, he was at the pinnacle of his career. A man who saw the world in terms of lines, angles, and the unforgiving laws of physics. His vision was flawless, his standards impossible, and his patience for human error was non-existent. For Julian, a building was a perfect equation. And any person who couldn't contribute to that perfection was simply an unnecessary variable. His latest obsession, the project that was to be the crowning jewel of his career, was the Solstice Tower. It wasn't just a skyscraper, it was a statement, a 100-story twisting spire of glass and steel designed to be the most innovative, most sustainable, and most awe-inspiring building in North America. The budget was a staggering $500 million, and the team he had assembled consisted of 15 of the most celebrated architects and structural engineers in the world. And for 3 agonizing months, they were failing. The problem was as subtle as it was catastrophic. The physical models were perfect. The material stress tests were flawless. But in the advanced wind tunnel simulations, something was wrong. At a specific velocity, a high-frequency vibration would appear in the upper third of the tower, a hum that would grow in intensity until the simulation predicted a catastrophic structural failure. They had run the simulation 100 times. They had recalculated every equation, and no one could find the flaw. The atmosphere in the war room, a state-of-the-art conference space on the top floor of the Thorne building, was thick with the toxic smog of genius thwarted. Blueprints covered every surface. Whiteboards were a chaotic mess of equations. And the 15-star architects were starting to turn on each other, their massive egos colliding in a symphony of blame and frustration. It must be the composite material, one argued, pointing a trembling finger at a cross-section diagram. The material is sound, another shot back. The fault is in the load-bearing calculations for the central spire. Julian stood in the center of it all, his face a mask of cold fury. Delays were costing them millions each day. More importantly, they were costing him his reputation for perfection. It was during this controlled chaos that Alara Vance moved like a ghost. At 29, she was part of the nightly cleaning crew, a woman so quiet and unassuming that most of the high-powered architects barely registered her presence. She would come in after they had left, emptying trash cans filled with crumpled sketches, wiping down tables stained with coffee and desperation. She wore the simple gray uniform of the service company, her dark hair pulled back in a neat practical bun. She was invisible, a necessary function in a world that didn't see her. But Alara saw everything. She would look at the discarded blueprints, at the abandoned equations on the whiteboards, and she would see more than just a building. She saw a story of ambition, of beauty, and of a single hidden flaw. She had studied architecture once, before life, in its cruel and unpredictable way, had torn her own blueprints to shreds. She never told anyone. It was a past she kept locked away, a secret ghost in her own personal archive. The breaking point came on a Thursday night. Julian, after another 14-hour day of fruitless debate, was the last one to leave the war room. In a fit of pure frustration, he had taken a massive blueprint of the tower's upper section, crumpled it into a ball, and thrown it towards the recycling bin. He missed. The crumpled paper lay on the floor, a testament to his failure. He stormed out, not noticing that Alara was just entering the room with her cleaning cart. She saw the discarded blueprint. Her hands, covered in thin rubber gloves, carefully picked it up. She smoothed it out on the vast, empty conference table, her fingers tracing the elegant, impossible lines of the tower. She saw the beauty in it, the soaring ambition. And then she saw the flaw. It wasn't in the materials. It wasn't in the load-bearing calculations. It was something smaller, something so fundamental that everyone had overlooked it. It was in the relationship between the glass panels and the steel frame, a detail about harmonic resonance that she only knew because of a tragedy she had tried her entire life to forget. Without thinking, she picked up a red marker that had been left on the table. She made a small, precise circle around a single connection point on the blueprint and wrote a single word beside it: resonance. Then, realizing what she had done, she quickly folded the paper, intending to throw it away properly. But at that moment, she heard footsteps. Julian was coming back. He had forgotten his briefcase. There was no time to hide the paper. She quickly tucked it into her cleaning cart, beneath a pile of cloths just as he walked in. He barely glanced at her, his mind clearly elsewhere. He snatched his briefcase from the table and turned to leave. Wait. Stopping at the door, he turned and looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. He had noticed her before, the quiet woman who always seemed to be there. "Do you have an opinion on this building?" he asked, the question a strange mixture of sarcasm and genuine exhaustion. Alara froze, her heart pounding. "Sir?" "This tower," he said, gesturing to the models around them. 15 of the best architects in the world, and they can't see what's wrong with it. You're here every night. You see the same plans they do. What's your expert analysis?" It was a cruel, rhetorical question, born of stress and arrogance. He didn't expect an answer. But Alara, holding the handle of her cleaning cart, her mind racing, decided she was tired of being invisible. "The building is too proud," she said, her voice quiet but clear. Julian raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his tired eyes. "Too proud?" "Yes," she said. "It's so focused on reaching the sky that it's forgotten about the wind. It's not listening to the forces around it. It thinks it can stand alone, without adapting." She looked him straight in the eye. "And things that don't adapt, they break." The words hung in the air, a perfect, unintentional diagnosis not just of the building, but of the man who had designed it. Julian stared at her, the sarcasm on his face dissolving into a look of stunned confusion. Who was this woman who spoke of architecture like a poet and looked at him as if she could see the cracks in his own foundation? Before he could say another word, she nodded politely. "Good night, Mr. Thorne." She pushed her cart out of the room, leaving him alone in the silence, a crumpled blueprint with a single, cryptic red circle hidden just a few feet away, a secret that held the key to saving his legacy, and a woman who was infinitely more than she seemed. The next morning, Julian arrived at the office to find the war room in a state of renewed panic. The final simulation, run overnight, had confirmed their worst fears. The vibration flaw was not minor, it was a fatal design error. The Solstice Tower, as it was currently designed, was a $500 million death trap. "We have to start over," his lead engineer, a man named Marcus, said, his face ashen. "A complete structural redesign. It will set us back at least a year and cost. God, I can't even calculate the cost." "No," Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet. "There's a solution. We're just not seeing it." His mind kept replaying Alara's words. "It's not listening to the wind." It was nonsense, of course, the poetic rambling of a cleaner. And yet, he spent the morning staring at the blueprints, his frustration mounting until he couldn't take it anymore. He needed to clear his head. He walked out of the war room and started pacing the hallways. It was then that he saw her again. Alara was in an empty office, carefully tending to a small potted orchid on a windowsill. He walked in, his decision impulsive. "I need you to come with me to the war room." She turned, surprised. "Sir, I have work to do." "This is more important," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He led her back into the room, past the stunned stares of the 15 architects. They looked from the CEO to the cleaning lady, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and disdain. "Gentlemen," Julian announced, "this is Alara. She has a different perspective on our problem. I want her to look at the plans." A wave of incredulous murmuring went through the room. "Julian, this is highly unorthodox," Marcus said, trying to be diplomatic. "We are beyond orthodox, Marcus," Julian snapped. "We are at the brink of a $500 million disaster. I will take insights from wherever I can get them." He turned to Alara. "Don't be intimidated. Just look. Tell me what you see." Alara felt the weight of 16 pairs of skeptical eyes on her. Her heart was pounding, but she took a deep breath and walked to the main blueprint, spread out on the table. She looked at the elegant lines, the complex calculations. She remembered the crumpled paper in her cart. This was her chance. "The problem," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "isn't in the core, it's in the skin." The architects exchanged confused glances. "The glass panels," she continued, her finger tracing a line on the blueprint. "You've designed them to be rigid, to resist the wind, but you can't fight the wind. You have to work with it. You have to let the building breathe." "Breathe?" One of the younger architects scoffed. "It's a skyscraper, not a lung." Alara ignored him, her focus entirely on the blueprint. The connection points between the steel frame and the glass panels, they are too stiff. They transfer the wind's energy directly into the superstructure, creating a harmonic resonance, a vibration that builds on itself until it becomes destructive. She looked up, meeting Julian's intense gaze. "The building isn't just proud, it's stubborn. It needs to learn how to dance." She then did something that made the entire room gasp. She picked up a red marker, and with a steady hand, she drew a small, almost imperceptible modification on the blueprint, right at the connection point she had identified the night before. "Here," she said. "You don't need a complete redesign. You need a different kind of joint. A flexible, dampening joint, something that absorbs the wind's energy instead of fighting it. It will allow the panels to move just a fraction of a millimeter, dissipating the vibration before it can build." The room was utterly silent. It was a solution so simple, so elegant, and so fundamentally different from their own rigid thinking that no one had ever considered it. Marcus, the lead engineer, was the first to move. He walked to the table, bent down, and studied the small red circle she had drawn. He was silent for a long, long time. Then, he straightened up, his face a mask of dawning realization. "My God," he whispered. "She's right." He looked at the other engineers. "She's absolutely right. The resonance isn't coming from the structure. It's being created by the facade. We've been looking in the wrong place for 3 months." He turned to Alara, his expression one of pure, unadulterated awe. "How did you know that?" Alara felt her cheeks flush under the sudden, intense scrutiny. "I've seen something like it before," she stammered. Julian stepped forward, his eyes never leaving her face. "Where?" he asked, his voice quiet but insistent. "Where have you seen this before, Alara?" She looked at the faces around her, at the 15 men who had dismissed her just minutes ago and were now staring at her as if she were a magician. She looked at Julian, at the intense, burning question in his eyes, and she knew she couldn't hide anymore. "I saw it," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "in the collapse of the Bridgeport Bridge." The name landed in the room like a stone. The Bridgeport Bridge collapse was a famous, tragic case study in structural engineering. A design flaw, a miscalculation of wind resonance, had caused the bridge to tear itself apart 8 years ago. "My father," Alara said, the words catching in her throat as she finally gave voice to the ghost she had carried for so long, "was the lead architect on that project. I was in my 2nd year of architecture school. I watched his career, his reputation, and his life fall apart because of a single, overlooked detail. A detail just like this one." The silence that followed Alara's confession was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of confusion or skepticism anymore. It was the heavy, reverent silence that falls in the presence of a profound and painful truth. The 15 architects, men who lived and breathed the world of structural integrity and design, knew the story of the Bridgeport Bridge all too well. It was a cautionary tale, a ghost story told to every first-year engineering student. And now, the ghost was standing in their room wearing a simple gray cleaning uniform. Julian stared at Alara, his mind struggling to connect the pieces. Alara Vance. He mentally added the surname, though he had no right to. He tried to remember the name of the architect from the Bridgeport disaster. It had been all over the news for months, a public crucifixion of a once-celebrated career. David Collins. No, that wasn't it. The name was less common. "Your father," Julian said, his voice softer than anyone in the room had ever heard it, "was Alexander Petrov?" Alara flinched as if the name itself was a physical blow, but she nodded, a single, heartbreaking gesture of confirmation. Alexander Petrov, a brilliant, visionary architect, an immigrant who had built a legendary career from nothing, only to see it all come crashing down with a single, catastrophic miscalculation. He had become a pariah, a symbol of hubris and failure. He passed away 2 years ago, Alara whispered, her gaze fixed on the floor. The official cause was a heart attack. But I know he died of a broken heart. He never recovered from the shame, from the public humiliation. He believed he had failed everyone. Marcus, the lead engineer, a man known for his stoic, no-nonsense demeanor, looked genuinely stricken. We studied his work in university, he said quietly. Before Bridgeport, he was a legend. His designs were poetic. He was a poet, Alara agreed, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. He saw buildings not as structures, but as living things. He used to say that a building had to have a soul, a rhythm. He taught me how to listen to the materials, to understand their language. She looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. The one thing he didn't account for was that sometimes the wind sings a destructive song. He miscalculated the harmonic frequency. A tiny error, a single decimal point in the wrong place, but it was enough to bring everything down. She took a shaky breath, pulling herself together with a visible effort of will. I've spent the last 8 years studying it, not just the engineering, but the physics, the aerodynamics. I read every report, every analysis. I needed to understand why it happened, what everyone missed. She looked at the blueprint on the table, at the small red circle she had drawn. Your tower was singing the same song, Mr. Thorne. I recognized the melody. The room was filled with a profound, humbling respect. The arrogance and skepticism of the architects had evaporated, replaced by an understanding of the deep, personal knowledge that had informed her insight. She wasn't just a cleaner who got lucky. She was the daughter of a fallen giant, a woman who had turned her family's greatest tragedy into her most powerful area of expertise. Julian felt a wave of something he couldn't quite name. It was more than just admiration. It was a deep, gut-wrenching empathy. He saw in her a reflection of his own burdens, the weight of a family legacy, the pressure to be perfect, the fear of a single mistake erasing a lifetime of work. But where he had responded by building walls and projecting an aura of cold control, she had responded by quietly, diligently seeking the truth. "Gentlemen," Julian said, his voice ringing with a new, clear authority that commanded the room's absolute attention. "I believe we have found our solution, and our new lead consultant on the Solstice Tower facade." Every head in the room turned to Alara. She looked completely taken aback, her face pale. "Me? Mr. Thorne? I can't. I don't have a degree. I'm a cleaner." "You are," Julian said, his gaze unwavering. "The only person in this room who saw the truth. That makes you more qualified than anyone here. Your title, your uniform, they are irrelevant. Your knowledge is what matters." He turned to the rest of the team. "Is there anyone here who disagrees?" 15 of the world's most accomplished architects stood in silence. Not a single one dared to challenge him. They had been humbled, not by a rival or a superior, but by the quiet, undeniable truth spoken by a woman they had considered invisible. I don't know what to say," Alara stammered. "Say you'll help us," Julian said gently. "Help us make this building not just tall but wise. Help us make it a testament to what we've learned, not just what we can build." Alara looked at him, at the genuine plea in his eyes. She thought of her father, of his tarnished legacy. This was a chance, an impossible, unexpected chance, to honor him, to take the painful lesson of his failure and turn it into a new story of success. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible but firm. "I'll help." The transition from Alara Vance, the night cleaner, to Alara Petrov, the lead consultant, was as jarring as it was exhilarating. Julian insisted she be given an office on the top floor, right next to the war room. He had her old gray uniform replaced with a wardrobe of simple, professional clothes, chosen by a stylist he hired but approved by Alara, who insisted on comfort and practicality over high fashion. The first few days were a strange, delicate dance. The architects, still reeling from the sudden shift in the hierarchy, treated her with a formal, almost fearful respect. They called her Miss Petrov. They would bring her complex calculations, their usual arrogance replaced by a hesitant humility. "Miss Petrov," Marcus would say, pointing to a new simulation. "Would you mind taking a look at the revised dampening coefficient?" Alara, for her part, was just as uncomfortable. She still felt like an imposter, a cleaner playing dress-up in a world of glass towers and expensive suits. She would answer their questions with her usual clarity, but she spoke softly, almost apologetically, as if she was afraid of taking up too much space. Julian saw her struggle, and he knew he had to do something to bridge the gap. He couldn't just give her a title, he had to give her a team, a sense of belonging. He called a meeting, not in the war room, but in a more casual lounge space. He ordered pizza, a move that left his executive assistant completely bewildered. "All right, everyone," he said as the team awkwardly grabbed paper plates. "Let's be clear about something. Alara is not a magical oracle who is going to solve all our problems. She is a part of this team. And this team, for the past 3 months, has been failing. Not because we're not talented, but because we've been operating in silos of ego. We've been competing with each other instead of collaborating." He looked around the room. "That ends today. From now on, this is not the Thorn team or the 15 individual star architects. This is the Solstice team, and Alara is a key player. I don't want you to treat her with formal distance. I want you to treat her like a colleague. Argue with her. Challenge her. Learn from her. And for God's sake, teach her. She has the knowledge, but we have the experience of working within this firm's systems. This is a partnership." He then turned to Alara. "And you," he said, his tone softening slightly, "stop apologizing for being brilliant. Own it. You've earned your place at this table. Now act like it." His words, blunt but supportive, were a catalyst. The awkward formality began to melt away, replaced by a new, more dynamic energy. The architects started to see Alara not as an outsider, but as a fresh, vital perspective. They were still in awe of her knowledge, but they were no longer intimidated by it. They started to see the warm, funny, and deeply compassionate woman behind the brilliant mind. The project was reborn. The meetings became lively, collaborative sessions. Alara, with her ability to explain complex physics using simple, intuitive metaphors, became the team's unofficial translator, bridging the gap between the structural engineers and the more artistic designers. "Think of it like a guitar string," she explained one afternoon, trying to describe the resonance issue to the design team. "If you pluck it, it vibrates at a certain frequency. The wind is plucking our building. We can't stop the plucking, but we can change the tuning of the string or put a finger on it to dampen the sound." Suddenly, everyone understood. Julian found himself spending more and more time in the war room, not as a CEO overseeing a project, but as an active participant. He was fascinated by the way Alara's mind worked. He loved watching her in her element, her face lit up with passion as she debated the merits of a new composite material or sketched out a solution on the whiteboard. Their own relationship was evolving, too. The formal Mr. Thorne and Miss Petrov were replaced by Julian and Alara. Their conversations drifted from work to more personal topics. He learned about her childhood, about her love for old books and rainy days. She learned about his hidden passion for sailing, a dream he had put on hold to run the family business. One evening, they were the last two left in the office, a common occurrence. They were looking over a new set of wind tunnel simulations, which were now showing perfect results. "We did it," he said, a note of quiet awe in his voice. "You did it." "No," she said, looking up at him. "We did it. I had the key, but you were the one who had the courage to open the door." They stood in the quiet of the office, the city lights twinkling outside the massive window. The professional line they had tried to maintain had become hopelessly blurred. He was acutely aware of her, of the soft scent of her perfume, of the way a stray strand of hair had escaped her bun and curled against her cheek. He reached out, his instinct to brush it back almost overpowering. But he stopped himself. He had made her a part of his professional world. He had no right to make assumptions about her place in his personal one. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice a little rougher than he intended as he stepped back. "It's been a long week." "You too, Julian," she said, a flicker of something unrateable, disappointment, relief, in her eyes. She packed her things and left, leaving him alone with the successful simulations and a profound, aching sense of loneliness. He had solved the problem of the tower, but the problem of his own heart, he was beginning to realize, was a far more complicated equation. He had invited her into his company, into his project. But how, he wondered, could he ever invite her into his life, a life still so defined by the cold, lonely legacy of the Thorn name? The Solstice Tower was back on track. and Alara Petrov was the undisputed hero of the hour. The initial awkwardness with the team had blossomed into a genuine and deeply effective collaboration. She was no longer just a consultant, she was the project's soul. Julian watched this transformation with a sense of pride that was so intense it was almost painful. He had discovered her. Yes, but she was shining entirely on her own. And the brighter she shone, the more he felt the distance between his world and hers. He had built his life on a foundation of control and emotional distance. He managed billion-dollar assets, but his personal life was an empty, sterile ledger. He had a vast, silent penthouse, a string of forgettable high-society dates that felt more like business transactions, and a profound, bone-deep loneliness he never acknowledged. Alara, on the other hand, was all connection, all heart. She had almost nothing in terms of material wealth, but she was rich in ways he was only beginning to understand. She had a close-knit circle of friends, a deep passion for her work, and an unwavering moral compass. He was in love with her. He knew it with a certainty that was as terrifying as it was absolute. But what did that even mean for a man like him? Love, in his experience, was a chaotic, destructive force. It was the thing that had led to his mother's early death, according to his father's bitter narrative. It was the thing that had made his business partners betray him. Love was a variable he couldn't control, and it scared him to death. So he kept his distance, treating Alara with a careful, respectful warmth that was both a shield and a prison. He was her biggest champion in the boardroom, but a hesitant stranger in the quiet moments they shared. Alara felt his hesitation, and it confused and hurt her. She saw the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, a look of such raw longing it made her heart ache. She felt the electric current that passed between them whenever their hands accidentally brushed. But just as she would think the wall between them was about to fall, he would retreat, pulling back into his shell of professional courtesy. She had her own fears. She was falling for a man who lived in a world she didn't belong to. A world of galas, of private jets, of people who judged you by your last name and the designer of your shoes. She was a cleaner who had gotten a lucky break. What would happen when the project was finished? Would she be sent back to her old life? A fascinating anecdote he would one day tell at a dinner party? The insecurity, a ghost she thought she had banished, crept back into the corners of her mind. The situation came to a head with the annual Architectural Guild Gala. It was the most important social event in their industry, and as the leaders of the city's most talked-about project, Julian and Alara were expected to attend. "You don't have to go if you don't want to," Julian said, his tone carefully neutral, as he handed her the gold-embossed invitation. "Why wouldn't I want to go?" she asked, her voice a little sharper than she intended. "Am I not presentable enough for your high-society friends?" "Alara, that's not what I meant," he said, taken aback by her defensiveness. "I just know these events aren't your scene." "And what exactly is my scene?" she challenged. "Dusty archives and cleaning carts?" "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," she said, the hurt in her voice now palpable. "I'll go. I'm the lead consultant on the Solstice Tower. It's my job to be there." She took the invitation and walked out of his office, leaving him standing there, frustrated and confused. He had been trying to be considerate, to give her an out, but he had only managed to push her further away. The night of the gala was a symphony of tension. Alara arrived looking breathtaking. She had designed and sewn her own dress, a simple, elegant column of deep blue velvet that made her look like a piece of the midnight sky. It was more stunning than any of the designer gowns in the room, and she had made it on her old sewing machine in her tiny apartment. Julian couldn't take his eyes off her. He met her at the entrance, and for a moment, all the unspoken words, the fears and the longings hung in the air between them. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice husky. "Thank you," she replied, her own voice a little shaky. "You don't look so bad yourself for a man who's afraid of his own feelings." It was a direct hit, a gentle but firm jab at the wall between them. He winced, but didn't deny it. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's an expert in reading the stories people try to hide," she said. They moved through the crowded ballroom, a perfect picture of a power couple. They were greeted by the biggest names in architecture. People who had once dismissed her father's name now clapped Julian on the back and congratulated him on his brilliant new visionary. The praise made Alara's stomach churn. They were celebrating a solution born from her father's tragedy, and they didn't even know it. The most difficult encounter was with Julian's father, Arthur Thorne, who was holding court in a corner, surrounded by a circle of fawning admirers. He saw them approach, and his face hardened. "Julian," he said, his tone icy, "and Miss Petrov, I see you're still enjoying your 15 minutes of fame." "It's a bit more than 15 minutes, father," Julian said calmly. "Alara has fundamentally changed the way this firm approaches design." "So I've heard," Arthur sneered. "Let's hope she doesn't also inherit her father's talent for dramatic failures." The cruelty of the remark was stunning. Alara felt the air leave her lungs. Before she could even react, Julian stepped in front of her, physically shielding her from his father. "That's enough," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You will not speak about her father or about her in that way ever again. Alexander Petrov was a brilliant man who made one mistake. And you, a man who has never had the courage to take a real creative risk in his life, have no right to stand on his grave and cast judgment." The entire circle of architects went silent. No one had ever spoken to Arthur Thorne like that, least of all his own son. Arthur was speechless, his face a mottled shade of red and white. "We're leaving," Julian said, taking Alara's hand. He turned his back on his father and led her through the stunned crowd, out of the ballroom, and into the cool night air. He didn't stop until they reached the quiet, moonlit garden of the museum. Alara was trembling, not from cold, but from the raw emotion of the moment. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked, for defending him, for defending me." "There's nothing to thank me for," he said, his back still to her as he stared out at the city. "I just told the truth." He turned to face her, and his eyes were filled with a pain and a clarity she had never seen before. "I've been a coward, Alara. My father, that whole world, I've let it define me for too long. I've let it keep me from you." He took a step closer, his hands finding hers. They were cold, and he warmed them in his own. "I'm not my father. I'm not my grandfather. I don't want to live a life ruled by fear and duty. I don't want to end up a lonely old man in an empty house, regretting the one love I was too afraid to claim." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "I'm in love with you, Alara Petrov. I'm in love with your brilliant mind, your fierce heart, and your unbreakable soul. I know I'm a mess. I know I'm still learning how to do this, how to feel. But I want to learn with you, if you'll let me." Tears were streaming down her face, but for the first time in a long time, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She had been so afraid that she didn't belong in his world. But she realized now that he didn't want to belong to it either. He wanted to build a new world. With her. "What took you so long, Thorne?" she asked, her voice a watery, laughing whisper. He laughed, a sound of pure relief. "I'm a slow learner," he said. "Well then," she said, her hands moving from his to cup his face. "Let me be your teacher." And there, in the quiet museum garden, under the watchful eyes of the moon, she kissed him. It was a kiss that sealed a new contract, an unspoken agreement to leave the ghosts of the past behind and to start designing a future of their own together. A future that promised to be as beautiful and as resilient as they were. The night of the gala was a seismic shift. They left the museum not as a CEO and his consultant, but as Julian and Alara, two people who had finally, terrifyingly, admitted their feelings to one another. The drive back to her small apartment was filled with a new, charged silence. It wasn't the awkward tension of before, but the quiet, humming energy of a story that was just beginning. When he pulled up in front of her building, he turned off the engine. He didn't want the night to end. "So," he said, turning to her, a small, nervous smile on his face. "What happens now?" "I don't know," she admitted, her own heart a fluttering mix of joy and apprehension. I've never done this before." "Done what?" "Fallen in love with a billionaire architect who I met while cleaning his office," she said with a laugh that was slightly shaky. He laughed with her, the sound warm and genuine in the quiet of the car. "Well, for what it's worth, I've never fallen in love with a secret structural engineering genius who also happens to be the daughter of my childhood hero. We're both in uncharted territory." The mention of her father sobered her slightly. Julian, about your father? What you said back there, it was brave, but it's going to have consequences. I know, he said, his expression turning serious, but I meant every word. I'm done letting him, or the ghost of him, dictate my life. My legacy is going to be my own, and I want it to be a legacy we build together. The word we hung in the air, a beautiful, terrifying promise. He leaned in, his intention clear. This time, the kiss was not born of a dramatic confrontation, but of a quiet, mutual decision. It was gentle, exploratory, a question and an answer all at once. It was a kiss that tasted of hope. Come work with me tomorrow, he whispered against her lips. Not in the office, somewhere else. I want to show you something. The next morning, he didn't take her to a construction site or a boardroom. He drove them 2 hours out of the city, deep into the heart of the countryside, to a place she had never seen. It was a large, beautiful piece of land, rolling green hills dotted with old-growth trees, and in the center, a serene, crystal-clear lake. What is this place? She asked, stepping out of the car and breathing in the clean, fresh air. This, he said, coming to stand beside her, is my grandfather's folly. She looked at him, puzzled. He bought this land 50 years ago, Julian explained. He dreamed of retiring here, of building a small, beautiful house, a place for contemplation and creation. He drew up the plans himself. It was going to be his masterpiece, a building that was in harmony with nature, not in defiance of it. What happened? My great-grandfather happened, Julian said, his voice laced with a familiar sadness. He called it a waste of time and money. He said a Thorne's legacy was in the city, in monuments of power, not in some rustic cabin. He shamed my grandfather into abandoning the project. He pointed to a small, overgrown path. The foundations were laid. That's as far as he got. He led her down the path, and there, half hidden by weeds and wildflowers, was the faint outline of a house, a concrete foundation that had been waiting for half a century for a story to be built upon it. I come here sometimes, Julian confessed, his voice quiet. When the city gets to be too much, I sit here and I think about him, about the life he might have had. He looked at her, his eyes full of a new, raw vulnerability. I don't want to end up like him, Alara. A man full of quiet regrets. He reached into his briefcase, but instead of pulling out a contract, he pulled out a rolled-up blueprint. It was old, the paper yellowed with age. He unrolled it on the flat, sun-warmed concrete of the foundation. It was the original plan for the house, a beautiful, elegant design that was both modern and timeless. He was a poet, Alara whispered, her fingers tracing the lines, recognizing the same genius she had seen in her own father's work. Yes, Julian said. He was. He then pulled out another, newer set of blueprints. And this, he said, unrolling them beside the first, is my version. She looked at the new plans. He had kept the soul of his grandfather's design, the clean lines, the respect for the landscape, but he had updated it, infused it with the sustainable, innovative technologies they had been working on for the Solstice Tower. There was a green roof, solar panels, a geothermal heating system. It was a perfect synthesis of the past and the future, of his legacy and hers. I want to build this, he said. Not as a monument, not as a legacy, but as a home, our home, if you'll have it. Alara stared at the plans, then at him, her heart so full she thought it might burst. He wasn't just offering her a house. He was offering her a shared dream, a chance to build something new and beautiful from the foundations of a forgotten story. But what about the company? She asked. Your life is in the city. My life, he said, taking her hand, is wherever you are. We can run the company from anywhere. We can build a new kind of firm, a new kind of life, one that has boardrooms, yes, but also has this. He gestured to the open sky, the quiet lake, the promise of a peaceful future. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at the man in front of her. He had not just changed, he had been reborn. The cold, arrogant CEO was gone, replaced by a man who had the courage to honor the forgotten dreams of his ancestors and to build a new one of his own. I have one condition, she said, a playful smile breaking through her tears. He raised an eyebrow. I'm starting to get used to your conditions. The design for the east wing, she said, pointing to the blueprint. The sun exposure is all wrong, and the flow from the kitchen to the garden is inefficient. She picked up a stray piece of charcoal from the ground and, kneeling on the old foundation, she began to sketch, redesigning his dream, making it theirs. He knelt beside her, watching her hand move with a familiar, mesmerizing grace. "You're right," he said, a laugh in his voice. "It's much better that way." And there, on the forgotten foundation of his grandfather's broken dream, they began to design their future. A future built not on the rigid lines of duty and expectation, but on the beautiful, collaborative, and perfectly imperfect blueprint of their love. The news that Julian Thorne, the king of the urban skyscraper, was building a country home and semi-retiring from the day-to-day operations of his firm sent another shockwave through the architectural world. The news that his partner in both life and design was Ilara Petrov, the brilliant but previously unknown consultant, added a delicious layer of intrigue. They spent the next year in a blissful creative whirlwind. The construction of their new home became their shared project. They were on site almost every day, arguing with contractors, debating over material samples, and working side by side, a perfect partnership of his structural logic and her intuitive, human-centric vision. The Solstice Tower, meanwhile, was nearing completion. Ilara remained its lead consultant, joining meetings via video call from their makeshift office in a construction trailer overlooking the lake. The team, now fully won over, revered her. Her notes from the wilderness, as they jokingly called them, were considered gospel. She had not only saved the project, she had given it a soul. Their life was a quiet rhythm of work and peace. They would spend their days on the construction site, and their evenings walking by the lake, talking for hours. He learned about her father, about the deep love of design he had instilled in her. She learned about his mother, about her quiet strength and the void her absence had left in his life. They were healing each other's pasts while building their shared future. The house, when it was finally finished, was a masterpiece. It was a home that seemed to grow out of the landscape, a place of light and wood and glass that was both breathtakingly beautiful and incredibly comfortable. It was a home that listened to the wind. The grand opening of the Solstice Tower was a major international event. Julian and Ilara flew back to the city for the ceremony. As they stood on the observation deck of the 100th floor, looking out at the world, a crowd of reporters and dignitaries surrounded them. Arthur Thorne was there. He had been quiet for the past year, watching his son's transformation from a distance. He approached them, his expression unreadable. "The building is a success," Arthur said, the words seeming to cost him a great deal. "Yes," Julian said calmly, his arm securely around Ilara's waist. "It is." Arthur then did something that stunned Julian. He turned to Ilara. "My father, he would have been proud of what you did here, Miss Petrov. You honored his original vision in a way no one else could have." He extended his hand. "Thank you." Ilara took his hand, her own expression one of quiet grace. "He was a great man," she said simply. "It was an honor." It was a small moment, a quiet truce in a long and painful war. But it was a beginning. Later that night, back at their new home by the lake, Julian and Ilara sat in front of a crackling fire, the city and its demands a world away. "You were incredible today," he said, stroking her hair. "You handled my father with more grace than I've ever managed." "He's just a man with his own story of loss," she said softly. "It's easy to be kind when you understand the story." He looked at her, at the incredible woman who had redesigned his buildings, his company, and his entire life. "I have one last design proposal for you," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Oh, does our house need another wing?" she asked playfully. "No," he said, taking her hand and placing it on his heart. "This one, it's a little empty. I was thinking it could use a new occupant, or two, a long-term permanent installation." She looked at him, her eyes widening as she understood. "Julian, are you—" "I'm saying," he said, his voice thick with an emotion so profound it was almost holy, "that I want to fill this house with the sound of our children's laughter. I want to build a family with you, Ilara. A real one. Full of chaos and noise and unconditional love." She was crying now, tears of a joy so complete it was overwhelming. "Yes," she whispered, her hand still on his heart. "Yes, let's build a family." Life by the lake was a different kind of beautiful. The relentless, high-stakes rhythm of the city was replaced by the gentle, steady pulse of the seasons. For Julian, a man who had spent his entire life in a concrete and glass jungle, it was a profound re-education of the soul. He learned the names of the birds that nested in the old oak trees, the feel of cool earth in his hands as he helped Elara in their sprawling garden, and the simple, unparalleled joy of watching the sunset paint the lake in fiery colors from their porch. Their home, once just a set of blueprints, became a living, breathing entity, a testament to their shared vision. It was a place of light and warmth, filled with the scent of Elara's baking and the sound of Julian's surprisingly good piano playing, a skill he had rediscovered from his youth. It was a home built not just with steel and wood, but with love, forgiveness, and the quiet courage to start anew. The news of Elara's pregnancy sent a ripple of pure joy through their small, carefully constructed world. Julian's reaction was one of fierce, protective tenderness. He became obsessed with her comfort and well-being. He read every parenting book he could find, installed the most advanced, military-grade baby monitor on the market, and once tried to design a structurally optimized crib, a plan Elara gently vetoed in favor of a simple, beautiful one they found in a local antique shop. "Darling," she had said, laughing, as she looked at his complex schematics, "a baby doesn't need perfect load-bearing capacity. It just needs a safe, cozy place to sleep." He was learning. He was learning that not every problem required an engineering solution, that sometimes the best design was the simplest one, the one that came from the heart. Elara, for her part, embraced pregnancy with the same calm, steady grace she brought to everything. Her work on the Solstice Tower was complete, and she had transitioned into a new, more personal project. With Julian's full support, she began writing a book. It wasn't a technical manual on architecture, it was a memoir, a collection of stories about her father, about the lessons he had taught her, and about the hidden poetry in the world of design. It was her way of restoring his legacy, of giving his story the beautiful ending it deserved. They became a true partnership in every sense of the word. They still consulted on architectural projects, their firm, Thorne & Petrov, quickly becoming one of the most sought-after names in sustainable and human-centric design. But their work was now balanced with a life that was rich and full. They hosted small, intimate dinner parties where their eclectic mix of friends, engineers, artists, contractors, and librarians would engage in lively debates under the stars. Arthur Thorne became a cautious but regular visitor. The relationship between father and son was still a work in progress, a slow, careful rebuilding of a bridge that had been broken for decades. Arthur was still a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He would arrive with awkwardly chosen gifts for the baby, and would sit on the porch with Julian, not talking about business, but about sailing, about his own father, about the past. He never fully apologized for his actions, but in the quiet respect he showed Elara, and the clear, unadulterated pride he had in his son's newfound happiness, there was a form of redemption. "He's trying," Elara would say to Julian after his father left. "I know," Julian would reply, his hand on her growing belly. "We all are." Their twin daughters, Alexandra and Sophia, were born on a crisp autumn morning, arriving a little earlier than expected, as if they too had their own unpredictable schedule. They were tiny, perfect, and utterly overwhelming. Alexandra had Julian's intense blue eyes and a calm, observant nature. Sophia had Elara's dark, expressive eyes and a fiery, determined spirit that was evident from her first cry. Julian was completely undone. The man who had once commanded boardrooms with an iron will was reduced to a state of tearful, joyful awe. He held his daughters, one in each arm, and felt a love so vast, so profound, it seemed to reconfigure the very atoms of his being. He had built skyscrapers that touched the clouds, but he had never created anything as miraculous as this. The first few months were a beautiful, sleep-deprived blur. Their perfect, serene home became a chaotic symphony of crying, feeding, and endless diaper changes. They were exhausted, overwhelmed, and happier than they had ever been. Julian proved to be a surprisingly natural father. He would walk the floors with a crying baby at 3 a.m, his deep, rumbling voice humming off-key lullabies. He learned to distinguish between a hungry cry and a tired cry. He took on his share of the feedings and the cleaning, a true partner in the messy, wonderful business of raising a family. Elara watched him, her heart so full of love it felt like it might overflow. She saw the man he had become, a man who was not afraid of messes, a man who found his greatest purpose not in building empires, but in building a family. One evening, they were sitting on the floor of the nursery, surrounded by a sea of baby toys, watching their daughters sleep in their cribs. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked softly. "About what?" "About how it all started, a crumpled blueprint in a recycling bin." He smiled, reaching out to take her hand. "I think about it every day," he said. "I think about the fact that I almost walked out of that room. I was inches away from throwing away the key to my own happiness." "But you came back," she said. "No," he corrected gently, his eyes locking on hers. "You showed me the way back." He leaned in and kissed her, a soft, grateful kiss that was full of the quiet magic of their ordinary, extraordinary life. Their life story was not a simple, linear progression. It was a complex design, full of unexpected turns, of foundations that had to be torn down and rebuilt, of structures that were made stronger by the very forces that threatened to destroy them. It was a story of two people who had come from different worlds, carrying the weight of their own broken pasts. But together, on the forgotten foundation of a grandfather's dream, they had built more than just a house or a company. They had built a legacy of their own, a legacy of love, resilience, and the profound, unshakable belief that even the most flawed designs can be redeemed by a new blueprint, one drawn with a steady hand and a hopeful heart. And their greatest masterpiece was not the Solstice Tower, or the house by the lake, or even Alara's best-selling book, which was now inspiring a new generation of architects. It was the two small, sleeping girls in the next room, the twin spires of their new world, a testament to a love that had, against all odds, learned how to dance with the wind. As the years passed, the rhythm of their life settled into a beautiful, comforting melody. The Thorne and Petrov firm became a global force, not for its size but for its philosophy. They took on fewer projects, but each one was a masterpiece of sustainable, human-centric design. They built community centers, libraries, and affordable, beautiful housing, leaving a legacy of kindness and innovation in cities across the world. Julian never fully lost his love for data and efficiency, but it was now tempered by Alara's profound understanding of the human soul. She never lost her connection to her roots, ensuring that their foundation, which they had established in her father's name, continued to support students from underprivileged backgrounds who, like her, had dreams that were bigger than their circumstances. Their daughters, Alex and Sophie, grew up in a world that was a perfect blend of their parents. They were as comfortable on a construction site as they were in a library. They learned about load-bearing walls from their father and about the poetry of a well-placed window from their mother. They grew up in a home filled with love, laughter, and the quiet understanding that the strongest structures are always built on a foundation of empathy. One sunny afternoon, when the girls were about 7 years old, the family was walking through the city. They passed by the newly renovated Bridgeport Bridge, which had been rebuilt years ago, stronger and safer than before. "That's the bridge," Sophie said, her voice quiet as she pointed. She knew the story of her grandfather, a story her parents had told her not as a tragedy, but as a lesson in humility and the importance of learning from mistakes. Julian squeezed Alara's hand. He saw the flicker of old pain in her eyes, but it was now overlaid with a sense of peace. "Your grandfather was a brilliant man," he said to his daughters. "He dreamed of building beautiful things that would make people's lives better. And he did. And when he made a mistake, his story taught us all how to build things even better." He looked at Alara, his heart full of a love that had only deepened with time. "And his greatest creation," he said, his eyes locking with hers, "was your mother." Alara smiled, a real, radiant smile that still, after all these years, took his breath away. The ghost of Bridgeport had finally been laid to rest, replaced by a legacy of love and resilience that was now being passed down to a new generation. Their story was not just about building skyscrapers. It was about rebuilding lives, and in doing so, they had created a foundation that was truly unbreakable. 10 years after the grand opening of the Solstice Tower, the world of architecture had fundamentally changed, and Julian and Alara were at the heart of that transformation. Thorne and Petrov was no longer just a firm, it was a movement. Their philosophy of empathetic architecture, designing spaces that served the soul as well as the function, had become the new gold standard. They were selective, taking on only a handful of projects a year, each one a chance to tell a new story of community and connection. Their life by the lake had settled into a rhythm that was both peaceful and vibrant. Alex and Sophie, now 17, were brilliant, compassionate young women, a perfect, chaotic blend of their parents. Alex had her father's analytical mind and was a rising star in the world of competitive mathematics, but she also had her mother's love for stories, often spending her evenings writing poetry. Sophie had her mother's intuitive, artistic soul, a gifted painter whose canvases were filled with bold, emotional landscapes, but she also possessed her father's fierce determination and strategic thinking. Julian and Alara were no longer just husband and wife. They were a seamless partnership, their minds and hearts so intertwined that they often finished each other's sentences. He had found a deep, quiet joy in his life, a contentment that had nothing to do with stock prices or market share. The cold, arrogant CEO was a distant ghost, a character from a story he barely recognized as his own. Alara, for her part, had not just found her voice, she had amplified it, becoming one of the most respected figures in her field, a mentor to a new generation of designers who believed, as she did, that buildings could change the world. Her father's book, which she had finally published, was now required reading in architecture schools across the country, his legacy fully and beautifully restored. It was on a crisp, early autumn morning that a ghost from a different part of their past decided to reappear. Julian was in their sunlit home office, reviewing a proposal for a new community library in New Orleans, when his assistant's voice came through the intercom, hesitant and unsure. "Mr. Thorne? There's a gentleman here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment. His name is Arthur Thorne." Julian froze. His father. He hadn't seen or spoken to him in nearly a decade, not since that tense, silent truce at the Solstice Tower opening. After a few years of trying to maintain his old-world influence, Arthur had quietly retired, fading from the corporate world and living a reclusive life in the family's old, cavernous city mansion. "Send him in," Julian said, his voice steady, though his heart had begun to beat a little faster. Arthur Thorne walked into the bright, airy office, and he looked smaller than Julian remembered. The fierce, indomitable titan of industry was gone, replaced by an old man who looked tired and frail. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame, and he leaned heavily on a polished wooden cane. "Julian," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Father," Julian replied, standing up but not moving from behind his desk. "This is a surprise." "I know," Arthur said, his gaze drifting around the room, taking in the family photos on the shelves, the warm, comfortable furniture, the sense of a life well lived. His eyes lingered on a large framed photograph of Julian, Alara, and the girls, all of them laughing, taken on a sailing trip the previous summer. "You've built a good life here." "Yes," Julian said simply. "I have." There was a long, awkward silence. Arthur seemed to be struggling for words, a state so unnatural for him that it was deeply unsettling. "I came because," he started, then stopped, his pride warring with whatever had brought him here. "I need your help." Julian was so stunned he almost didn't respond. His father had never asked for help in his life. "What is it?" "It's the old Thorne building," Arthur said, finally meeting his son's eyes. "The original headquarters downtown. The city is planning to condemn it. Structural issues. They want to tear it down." The news hit Julian with an unexpected pang of sadness. That building, as cold and as soulless as it was the backdrop of his entire childhood. It was a monument to his family's history. "What kind of structural issues?" "The foundation," Arthur said, his voice full of a bitterness that was all too familiar. "It seems my father, your grandfather, cut some corners back in the 1920s, used a cheaper grade of steel. The inspectors say it's a miracle it stood this long. Now, after the last earthquake, it's unstable. They're calling it a public hazard." The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. His family's legacy, a legacy built on an image of unshakable strength and perfection, was literally built on a faulty foundation. "I've had my own engineers look at it," Arthur continued, his voice cracking slightly. "They say it's hopeless. A complete teardown is the only option. But Julian, I can't be the thorn who lets them tear it down." It was his first great achievement. Julian looked at his father, at this old, proud man, And he didn't feel anger or resentment, he felt a wave of pity. His father wasn't just trying to save a building. He was trying to save the one thing he had ever truly valued, his family's myth of perfection. There's one person, Arthur said, the words clearly costing him a great deal. The city's Historical Preservation Committee said they would only consider a restoration plan if it was designed by someone with a reputation for innovative structural solutions. Someone who understands how to honor the past while securing the future. He looked at his son, his eyes full of a desperate, pleading hope. They said they would only listen to your wife. The request was a bomb dropped into the peaceful heart of their life. Alara listened in silence as Julian recounted the conversation that evening, her expression unreadable. "He wants me to save his father's legacy?" she said finally, her voice a quiet marvel of disbelief. "The same legacy that was built on the destruction of my own?" "I know," Julian said gently. "It's an impossible thing to ask. I told him I would tell you, but that the decision was entirely yours. If you say no, I will support you, 100%. We don't owe him anything." Alara was quiet for a long time, staring into the crackling fire. She thought of her father, of his ruined career, of the years of pain her family had endured. The instinct for justice, the desire to see Arthur Thorne's flawed legacy crumble to dust, was strong. It would be a fitting, poetic end. But then she thought of something else. She thought of Julian, of the man he had become, a man who had fought to break free from that same toxic legacy. She thought of their daughters, Alex and Sophie, who were part of that legacy too, whether they liked it or not. Tearing down the building wouldn't erase the past. It would just leave a hole where a story used to be. And Alara, above all else, was a believer in the power of stories. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm. Julian looked at her, his eyes full of a love and admiration so profound it left him breathless. "Are you sure?" "Yes," she said, a determined glint in her eye. "But not for him. I'm doing it for my father, and for yours. I'm going to take their two broken stories, their two flawed legacies, and I'm going to build something new and beautiful out of the wreckage." She looked at him. "But I'm not doing it alone. I need my partner." The project became their new obsession. It was the most complex challenge of their careers. They spent weeks in the dusty, abandoned Thorne building, a place Julian had avoided his entire adult life. Alara, with her unique ability to listen to buildings, found the structure's hidden secrets, its points of weakness, and its surprising strengths. Julian, with his mastery of modern engineering, found the innovative solutions. Their plan was audacious. They wouldn't just restore the building. They would transform it. The lower floors would be converted into a state-of-the-art museum dedicated to the city's architectural history, including an honest and unflinching exhibit on both the triumphs and the failures of the Thorne and Petrov legacies. The upper floors would become a vibrant, mixed-use space, affordable housing for artists, a public library, and the new, permanent home for the Pendleton Hayes Foundation. They weren't just saving a building. They were giving it a new soul. Arthur watched the process from a distance, a silent, humbled observer. He would visit the site, not to give orders, but to watch his son and his daughter-in-law work, their minds and hearts in perfect sync. He saw them not just as brilliant architects, but as healers, carefully and respectfully mending the broken bones of their shared past. The day they presented their final plan to the city's preservation committee, the room was packed. Arthur was there, sitting in the back row. Alara and Julian presented together. They told the story of the building, its flaws and its beauty. They told the story of their own families, of their pain and their redemption. And they presented their vision for the future. A building that would no longer be a monument to a single family's power, but a vibrant, living testament to the entire city's resilience. When they finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then, the head of the committee, a stern-looking woman known for her tough standards, simply said, "This is not just a restoration plan. This is a work of art, approved unanimously." As they were leaving the hearing, surrounded by a crowd of reporters, Arthur approached them. He didn't speak to Julian. He spoke directly to Alara. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion Julian had never heard from him before. "You didn't just save my father's building. You saved his name. Alara looked at the old man, at the tears shining in his tired eyes, and she did something that surprised them all. She reached out and hugged him. He was stiff at first, then he slowly, hesitantly wrapped his arms around her. "Your family," she whispered, "and family takes care of each other." Watching them, Julian knew that the final crack in his family's faulty foundation had just been healed. And it had been healed not by steel or concrete, but by the quiet, revolutionary power of forgiveness. The restoration of the Thorn building became more than just a project. It became a public symbol of a new era. The story of the two rival architectural legacies, once defined by tragedy and bitterness, now united by love and a shared vision, captured the city's imagination. The Thorn Petrov Accord, as one magazine dubbed it, was a testament to the idea that the past did not have to be a prison. The work on the building was a joyful, collaborative effort. Julian and Alara were there every day, their hard hats a familiar sight to the construction crew. Arthur Thorn became a regular but quiet presence. He would bring coffee for the workers, his old arrogance replaced by a gentle, almost paternal pride. He would watch his son and daughter-in-law work, their partnership a seamless dance of creativity and precision, and in his eyes Julian could see a quiet, profound sense of peace. He was a man finally making peace with his own ghosts. Alex and Sophie, now on the verge of heading off to college, spent their summer interning on the project. Alex, with her mathematical mind, worked with the engineering team, running stress test simulations. Sophie, with her artistic soul, worked with the curation team for the new museum, helping to design the exhibits that would tell their family's complicated, honest story. They were no longer just the inheritors of a legacy, they were active participants in its reinvention. Their home by the lake was their sanctuary, the place where the noise of the city and the weight of their work faded away, leaving only the quiet comfort of family. It was a place of loud family dinners, of intense debates over architectural theory, of movie nights with too much popcorn, and of a deep, abiding love that was the unshakable foundation of their world. It was during one of these quiet family evenings that the past decided to send one last, unexpected echo. The phone rang. A call from a number Alara didn't recognize. "Hello," she answered, a little distracted as she helped Sophie with a particularly tricky chord on the guitar. "Is this Alara Petrov?" a man's voice asked. It was a voice she hadn't heard in nearly a decade, a voice she had tried and failed to forget. She froze, the guitar pick slipping from her fingers. "Who is this?" "It's Daniel," the voice said. "Daniel Collins." The name hit her like a punch to the gut. Daniel Collins, her ex-fiancé, the man she had been with in architecture school, the man who had been with her when the Bridgeport Bridge collapsed. The man who, in the aftermath of her father's public disgrace, had quietly, devastatingly walked away, telling her he couldn't afford to have his own promising career tarnished by association. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice cold and steady, a skill she had perfected over the years. I saw the articles," he stammered, his usual smooth confidence gone. "About you, about the Thorn building. Alara, it's incredible, what you've done." "I'm busy, Daniel," she said, ready to hang up. "Wait," he said, his voice laced with a desperation she had never heard from him before. "Please, I need your help. My firm, we're in trouble. We're on the verge of losing everything. There's a project, a competition for the new City Arts Center. It's our last chance, and I know you're the only one who can help us win it. Your vision, your name." The audacity of it was breathtaking. After a decade of silence, after abandoning her at the lowest point of her life, he was coming to her now, not to apologize, but to ask for a favor. "Let me get this straight," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "You want me to save the career you chose over me?" There was a long, pathetic silence on the other end of the line. "Yes," he finally whispered. "I'll think about it," she said, and hung up the phone. She stood in the quiet of her living room, her hands trembling not with fear, but with a white-hot, righteous anger. Julian, who had been watching from the doorway, saw the look on her face. "Who was that?" he asked gently. "A ghost," she said, her voice tight. "A ghost I thought I had buried a long time ago." She told him the story. About Daniel, about their shared dreams in architecture school, about the promise of a future together that had evaporated the moment her family name became a liability. "He was my first love," she confessed, her voice full of an old, deep hurt. And he was the first person to teach me that love, for some people, is conditional. Julian listened, his own anger rising in a protective wave. You don't owe him anything, Alara, he said, his voice firm. You don't have to even consider it. I know, she said, pacing the room, but that's the thing. He's not just asking for himself. His firm has 30 employees, families, people who will lose their jobs if he fails. She stopped and looked at him, the old familiar weight of responsibility in her eyes. It's not about him, it's about them. He saw the war in her. The desire for justice for herself versus her innate, profound compassion for others. What do you want to do? He asked, knowing the decision had to be hers. She was quiet for a long moment. I want to meet him, she said finally. I want to hear him say it to my face, and then I'll decide. The meeting was set for the following day, in the neutral territory of a quiet cafe. Daniel was already there when she arrived, looking older, more tired than she remembered. The easy, boyish charm had been replaced by the strained anxiety of a man on the brink of failure. Alara, he said, standing up as she approached. Thank you for coming. I'm not here for you, Daniel, she said, her voice clear and direct as she sat down. I'm here for your employees. You have 5 minutes. He flinched at her coldness, but he deserved it. He quickly, desperately, laid out the situation. His firm had overextended, made a series of bad investments, and was now on the verge of bankruptcy. The competition for the new art center was their only lifeline. The design brief it's perfect for you, he said, pushing a folder across the table. It's all about community integration, sustainable materials, a space that tells a story. It's everything you've become a champion for. And you want me to just hand you my ideas? She asked, her voice incredulous. The ideas you once thought were worthless? He had the grace to look ashamed. I was a fool, Alara, he said, his voice low. I was young, ambitious, scared. I made the biggest mistake of my life. I let my fear of what people would say, of what it would do to my career, outweigh what I felt for you. There hasn't been a day in the last 10 years that I haven't regretted it. She was silent, a storm of old emotions swirling inside her. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, he said, his eyes pleading. I know I don't deserve it. I'm just asking for a chance to save the livelihoods of the people who depend on me. At that moment, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Julian. Thinking of you. Remember who you are, a queen who builds her own castles. She looked at the text, then back at the desperate man sitting across from her. And she knew what she had to do. It wasn't about forgiveness, it wasn't about revenge. It was about who she had become. I won't give you my ideas, Daniel, she said, her voice firm. He deflated, the last of his hope seeming to drain away. I'm going to do something better, she continued. I'm going to teach you how to find your own. He looked at her, confused. Your problem isn't your design, she said, pushing the folder back to him. It's your vision. You're still trying to build buildings that impress. You've forgotten how to build buildings that matter. She stood up. Thornton Petrov is entering the competition for the Arts Center, officially, as your rival. Alara, you can't, he stammered. We'll be destroyed. No, she said, a small, confident smile on her face. You'll be forced to be better. You'll be forced to dig deeper, to find a real story to tell. I'm not going to save you, Daniel. I'm going to challenge you. It's the most compassionate thing I can do. She turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving him sitting there, stunned. When she got home, she found Julian waiting on the porch. So? He asked. So? She said, a fierce, brilliant light in her eyes. We have a new project, and we're going to win. He smiled, a look of pure, unadulterated adoration on his face. I never had any doubt, he said. The competition for the new art center became the talk of the architectural world. It was a clash of titans, the establishment versus the innovators, the old guard versus the new. But for Alara and Julian, it was something more. It was the ultimate test of their partnership. They worked side by side, their creative energies perfectly in sync. They were not just designing a building, they were telling a story about what a city could be. Their final design was a masterpiece. It was a building that was alive, a space that adapted to the needs of the community, with movable walls, a rooftop garden that would supply a community kitchen, and a central atrium that used the play of light and shadow to create a constantly changing work of art. On the day of the final presentations, they stood before the city council together. Daniel and his team presented before them. Their design was good, technically proficient, but it lacked a soul. Then Alara and Julian presented theirs. They didn't just show blueprints. They showed a vision. They told a story. They won. The decision was unanimous. That evening, Alara received a simple email. It was from Daniel. It just said, "Thank you. You were right." His firm had lost the competition, but he had found something more important. A reason to be a better architect. Alara closed her laptop and walked out to the porch, where Julian was waiting with 2 glasses of wine. "To victory?" he asked, raising his glass. "No," she said, clinking her glass against his. "To building better stories." 20 years. 2 decades had passed since Julian Thorne and Alara Petrov had stood on the forgotten foundation of his grandfather's dream and decided to build a new world together. The world they built was more beautiful, more complex, and more wonderfully chaotic than either of them could have ever imagined. The house by the lake was no longer just a home. It was a living archive of their love story. The walls were covered with framed photos. The twins, Alex and Sophie, as gap-toothed 7-year-olds on the construction site of the Thorne Petrov Art Center. A teenage Alex proudly holding her first-place trophy from the International Math Olympiad. A teenage Sophie, covered in paint but beaming, standing next to her first solo art exhibition. There were pictures of Arthur Thorne, in his later years, teaching his granddaughters how to sail on the lake, the old cold mask of the CEO finally gone, replaced by the gentle, loving face of a grandfather. Thorne and Petrov had become the most respected architectural firm in the world, not for its size, but for its soul. They had pioneered a movement, changing the very language of design. Their buildings were more than just structures. They were communities. They were stories. They were living testaments to the idea that a building could have a heart. The old, controversial Thorne building downtown was now the city's most beloved cultural hub. The Thorne Petrov Legacy Center, as it was now called, housed the Museum of Architectural History, a bustling public library, and the ever-growing foundation that had sent thousands of underprivileged students to college. It was a place of healing, a symbol of how the most broken foundations could be rebuilt, stronger and more beautiful than before. Julian, now in his early 60s, had gray at his temples, and the intense, driven energy of his youth had softened into a quiet, profound wisdom. He had found his true calling not as a titan of industry, but as a mentor, a teacher, and a philanthropist. He spent his days guiding the young architects at their firm, teaching them not just about structural integrity, but about the integrity of the soul. Alara, her dark hair now streaked with silver, was more vibrant than ever. She was a celebrated author, a sought-after speaker, and the undisputed matriarch of the architectural world. But her greatest joy was still in the small, quiet moments. The feel of soft earth in her garden, the scent of an old book, the sound of her family's laughter echoing through their home. Their love had deepened over the years, settling into a comfortable, easy rhythm. A partnership so complete it was hard to tell where one of them ended and the other began. They were still a perfect, chaotic blend of his logic and her intuition, a constant, loving negotiation between the spreadsheet and the story. On a bright, sunny afternoon in June, the entire family was gathered by the lake. It was a special day. Alex, who had inherited her father's brilliant, analytical mind, was graduating from MIT with a dual degree in architecture and data science. Sophie, who possessed her mother's artistic soul, was graduating from the Rhode Island School of Design, her thesis project, a series of breathtaking paintings inspired by the emotional life of buildings, already causing a stir in the art world. They were celebrating with a simple, joyful picnic on the lawn that sloped down to the water. Arthur, now in his late 80s and frail but with a clear, happy light in his eyes, was there, holding court from a comfortable armchair. "I always knew those girls were special," he said to Alara, watching as Alex and Sophie engaged in a lively debate about the structural aesthetics of a nearby birdhouse. "They have your vision, and his stubbornness," Alara laughed. "A formidable combination, isn't it?" "Indeed," Arthur said, his gaze softening as he looked at his son. Julian was at the grill, attempting to flip burgers with a look of intense concentration, a task he found infinitely more challenging than designing a suspension bridge. He's a good man, you're Julian, Arthur said quietly. A better man than his father. You're a good man too, Arthur, Alara said, placing her hand on his. You just took a little longer to find your way. He smiled, a real, genuine smile. I had a good teacher, he said, his eyes meeting hers with a deep, quiet gratitude. Later, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the lake, Julian and Alara slipped away from the party and walked down to the small wooden dock. Well, he said, wrapping his arm around her as they looked out at the water. We did it! We got them through college. They're officially brilliant, independent young women. Were you ever worried they wouldn't be? She asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. Terrified, he admitted with a laugh. But I should have known better. They're your daughters, after all. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as their girls, now grown, walked along the shoreline, still deep in conversation, their futures stretching out before them, bright and full of promise. You know, Alara said thoughtfully, my father always dreamed of this, of a legacy that wasn't just made of concrete and steel, but of ideas, of knowledge being passed down. She looked at her daughters. I think he would have been so proud. He is, Julian said softly, just like my grandfather is. They're all here, in the foundation of this house, in the design of that tower, in the hearts of those two incredible young women. At that moment, Alex and Sophie ran up to the dock, their faces full of excitement. Mom, Dad, Alex began, we have some news. We've been talking, Sophie continued, her eyes sparkling, and we have a proposal. We want to start a new project. Julian and Alara exchanged a smile. We're listening, Julian said. We want to take the Thorne Petrov Philosophy International, Alex said, her voice full of her father's strategic clarity. But on a smaller, more impactful scale. We want to design and build sustainable, beautiful, and culturally relevant community centers and schools in developing countries. Places that don't just provide shelter, but inspire hope. We'll use local materials, work with local artisans, and create designs that honor the stories of the communities we're serving, Sophie added, her voice full of her mother's passionate vision. We'll call it the Petrov Project, in honor of Grandpa. Julian and Alara looked at each other, their hearts so full they thought they might burst. It was all there, the synthesis of their two worlds, the fusion of his logic and her soul, the legacy of their families, not just restored but reborn, transformed into a force for good that would now stretch across the globe. That, Alara said, her voice thick with happy tears, is the most beautiful design I have ever heard. And what about you two? Julian asked, his own eyes misty. You have your own careers, your own paths. This is our path, Alex said firmly. You taught us that the most important work is the work that builds something that matters. And you taught us, Sophie added, taking her sister's hand, that the best stories are the ones we build together. Julian pulled his entire family into a tight hug there on the old wooden dock as the last rays of the setting sun danced on the water. The foolish CEO and the invisible cleaner, the two broken legacies. They had come so far. And they had built so much. Later that night, long after the girls had gone to bed, Julian and Alara were sitting by the fire, a comfortable silence between them. He reached over and took the well-worn, leather-bound book from the mantelpiece. It was Alara's first edition copy of her father's memoir. He opened it to a random page and began to read aloud, his voice a low, steady rumble. It was a passage about the nature of design. A building is never just a building. He read, it is a vessel for human experience. It holds our hopes, our fears, our joys, and our sorrows. The job of the architect is not to create a perfect structure, but to create a space that has the grace to hold the beautiful, messy imperfection of a life. He closed the book and looked at his wife, at the incredible woman who had taught him the meaning of those words. He would have loved you, she whispered. He does, he replied, taking her hand. Because he lives on, in you, in our daughters, in everything we've built. He pulled her closer, and they sat there for a long time, watching the flames dance. Their story was not over. It would continue in the work of their children, in the buildings they had designed, in the countless lives they had touched. Their love was now a legacy, a structure built on the strongest of all foundations, a design that was truly timeless. What did you think of the story of Julian and Alara? On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate their lifelong journey? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And for everyone who has stayed with us to the very end, who believes that even the most broken foundations can be rebuilt, please comment with a simple legacy. We are so grateful to share these stories with you. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more narratives that build a better world.